everyone. My name is Boyd Allen. I'm your host for a series of podcasts presented by the Coalition for the Protection of PEI Lands, titled Landlines, Discussions about Land Use on Prince Edward Island. The Coalition for the Protection of PEI Lands acknowledge that Prince Edward Island is part of the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Furthermore, as non-Indigenous people today, we are inheritors of the treaties signed with the Mi'kmaq by our settler ancestors. At no time did these treaties grant rights of ownership to the settlers. To this day, therefore, in all our conversations, plans, and actions around the protection of PEI lands, the expression "our land" requires us to acknowledge that "our" must be understood as a shared responsibility, not ownership. We formed the Coalition for the Protection of PEI Lands in 2018 as a means to raise awareness about land issues in PEI and also to hold government to account on its responses to these issues. This series of podcasts is a result of consultations with our members and those who follow us on social media, which looked at ways we may try in the Coalition's continuing effort to share information and spark discussion on the issues around land use and abuse on the island, and why successive governments have appeared unwilling to be transparent about why these issues continue to happen. Today's episode is called Protecting PEI's Wetlands, Policy and Practice. Our guest is Ms. Heather Laiskonis, Executive Director of the PEI Watershed Alliance. Natural wetlands cover approximately 5.1% of the island, 1% of the island. A wetland is defined in the Canadian Wetland Classification System is land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes as indicated by poorly drained soils, hydrophytic vegetation, and various kinds of biological activity which are adapted to a wet environment. Wetlands include bogs, fens, marshes, swamps, and shallow waters. Wetland functions are defined as the natural processes and derivation of benefits and values associated with wetland ecosystems. On the island, these ecosystems, consisting of a mix of freshwater, wetlands, and coastal salt marshes, play a vital role in supporting biodiversity. They are essential for the system of sustainability of natural systems and human and community well-being. In addition to being among the most productive and biological diverse ecosystems on the planet, their importance spans ecological, economic, social, and cultural dimensions. Freshwater wetlands constitute 79% of the total wetland area. Freshwater wetlands are diverse, including open ponds, black spruce bogs, wooded and shrub swamps, alder swales. There has been and continues to be a pattern of extensive freshwater wetland drainage and infilling for agriculture and urbanization. PEI has little salt marsh considering the province has 2,800 kilometers of coastline. They cover only 5% of the exposed coastline. Salt marshes in PEI serve as vital nurseries for marine life by providing crucial habitats for juvenile fish, shellfish, and countless other species, plant and animal, while continually contributing globally to carbon sequestration. Salt marshes continue to be threatened by coastal developments, particularly cottage subdivisions and municipal development projects. It has been estimated that 2/3 of the Atlantic coastal salt marshes are gone. Salt marshes also are increasingly vulnerable to climate change impacts, such as sea level rise and coastal erosions. When coastal development has occurred, they are further and further degraded as a result of terrestrial runoff and sedimentation. Wetland conservation has become an international priority. The World Commission on Environment and Development has stressed that, quotes, wetland conservation is dependent on the incorporation of environmental objectives into the economic decision-making process. One guiding principle of Canadian federal policy on wetland is they are a priority requirement of environmental conservation and sustainable development efforts, and that wetland conservation can only be achieved through a coordinated, cooperative approach involving all levels of government and the public, including landowners, non-government organizations, and the private sector. Management and conserving wetlands in Prince Edward Island rests with the Department of Environment, Energy and Climate Action. It is also responsible for wetland habitat, biodiversity functions, and for groundwater and surface water quality and quantity. On the island, the non-governmental organization most often representing the wetlands themselves is the PEI Watershed Alliance. It represents 25 community-based watershed groups across Prince Edward Island. The overall goal of the PEIWA is to improve and protect the environmental quality of Prince Edward Island watershed for the benefit of all island residents. The PEI Watershed Alliance is deeply concerned about wetland infilling across PEI. The executive director of the PEI Watershed Alliance and our guest today is Heather Laiskonis. Heather holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Wildlife Conservation and a Master's degree in Fisheries Resource Management from the Fisheries and Marine Institute of Memorial University of Prince Edward Island. Heather worked her way through school as a wildlife technician in the PEI's South Shore and previously worked in management in the private sector in New York City and the greater Detroit area. She has been in her position with the PEIWA since 2022. We're happy to have the opportunity to talk with her today about the policy and practice of wetland conservation on PEI. Thank you for joining us today, Heather. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the current policy and practice around wetland protection on PEI. The PEI Watershed Alliance represents 25 watershed groups from all over the island. Trying to strike a consensus must be a bit of a challenge. Can you give us a description of the scope of PEIWA's activities?
I will do my best. First and foremost, we are the support organization for 25 watershed groups. The Watershed Alliance was founded in 2010 as a volunteer organization to support the needs of the 25 watershed groups and to provide a united voice for all of them. There's a lot of advocacy work that we do, even though we're not an advocacy organization. And that takes a lot of time that our groups don't necessarily have. They are our boots on the ground. They get the work done. So these are the people that are moving the logs and running the chainsaws. And they have a very limited time because most of our crews are only working in the summer where they can hire summer students. And based on when we're allowed in the streams because of migratory fish patterns, we have limited time to do our work. So when they go hard and fast, and sometimes they can't get up for a breath to address some of these challenges that face them in their watersheds. So that's what we do. We also do some of the boring things like liability insurance. We provide health insurance. We provide their savings plans, their retirement savings plans. We provide a shared equipment bank. We have an electrofisher that's a $16,000 piece of equipment, probably now $25,000 actually. So we maintain the equipment needed to do the monitoring in the groups. Some groups have their own, but most of them rely on our equipment bank. We monitor and have monitored, going into our 6th year now, our bat populations. And we do that in conjunction with the province and our 25 watershed groups. 3 years ago, we launched a river otter monitoring program, again, in conjunction with the province. We also have a salmon project going on that's funded through the federal government. So we're working on standardizing collection methods of fish data and mapping them throughout the island. We provide a shared resource on our website for all of our groups to put their projects up. We do this so it combats knowledge loss. When you have people retire, board members retire, sometimes people don't know what has happened in an area. So to see it all on one map is actually really exciting, and it's really good for funders to be able to see that as well. We carry out the provincial arm of the federal 2 billion trees project. So ours is the PEI 2 billion trees project. So we'll come out to your house and assess your property as long as it's under 2.5 acres. And then we'll come out and plant trees for free. We have a couple other cool projects. We have a project with the European Space Agency right now that we are working with them to develop some satellite training tools for our groups so that they can nonprofits can look into marine systems using this tool and get more up-to-date mapping so they'll be able to, hopefully the goal, it's not done yet. I like to say the squirrels are busy working, but hopefully at the end of this project, we'll be able to have access to the software that can show us, red water events or when some streams or estuaries go anoxic. So hopefully we'll be able to look at that in real time. So I guess, have our fingers in a lot of different pies.
Well, it seems like the advocacy component to it and the public education component to it is becoming a lot more prevalent in what you're doing as well.
When I started, there were 3 employees at the Watershed Alliance. I'm their first non-governmental executive director. So it's amazing what you can do when you have a body. So I think that's, as we grow, we actually have people that we can devote to all of these different projects. And that allows us time to research the issues, go out and talk to the people, talk to the watershed groups, and find out what kind of challenges they're facing so that we can come back and strategize an advocacy plan, platform, campaign, whatever it is for the groups. Because they're all really shared environmental concerns. I mean, people think what happens at Tignish doesn't affect, anything in Surrey, but that's just not the case. And hopefully we're gaining a little bit more knowledge. I did see that through Fiona, where suddenly people were putting together some ecosystem services that they had never really thought about before, mowing their lawn up until the edge of a cliff because for the view, they never thought about that before. And then when they realized, oh, my property got hammered because I've been mowing my lawn and my neighbor's property had trees and shrubs and they only lost 1 meter and I lost 15. So we saw a lot of sort of aha moments in the community with that. So that was.
And you've got a platform to be able to bounce that across the island, up, through the various watershed groups as well.
Yes, they can amplify our voice and we can amplify theirs. So, we try our best to help them in situations if they don't have the capacity to do it. And we can kind of beat that drum amongst other environmental players on the island that does amplify it and can draw attention to certain things that we might not think are the best management practices for an environmental landscape, a healthy environmental landscape.
Now, I'm sure funding has always been a challenge. In April of 2024, the province reestablished the Watershed Management Fund to provide financial support to community-based watershed groups. A fund serving this purpose amounted to $152,000, which had been started in 2003. This has incrementally increased over the years, and now, under this new framework, has reached about $2.2 million. Does this provide more stability for the Alliance?
More so for the group. So we take about 2% of that pie. Right now, our piece of the pie is about $45,000 a year. So it's not really core. It's important. Don't get me wrong. I'm thrilled.
You would certainly miss its being there.
Yeah, absolutely. But what it does is it supports our groups in a way that shows that they value our watershed groups as stewards of the land and shows that they recognize them as the stewards of our land. And so in order to do that, you have to have somebody there to do it. So prior to this, and I know in years past, people looked at the watershed groups as like an EI stamp sort of program, like you go get your stamp, go work for the watershed. And it has evolved so much over the years from that. And I wasn't here. I'm only told that. I don't know how true it is, but I can tell you unequivocally that is not the case now. We have people with master's degrees, PhDs, working on PhDs, working on their master's degrees, people with 30, 40 years experience in the same watershed. It is a vast network of highly educated, highly trained people. And this core funding allows us to keep one coordinator on all year round for the majority of our groups. So I just want to put that, the 2.2 sounds like a lot, and it is, and we're grateful, but it's, when you spread that out over 25 groups, you have to look at, no one's getting rich. It pretty much covers the salary of one coordinator to be on for full time for the whole year. And it's important to note that if you look at that 2.2 million that the province does provide and support, the return on investment is like that would cost a minimum 22 million for the government to provide those same services, because our groups run on volunteer boards, we run on student labor, we run on matching with federal funds, with provincial dollars from other funds, fundraising, things that the government, of course, would not do.
But it also, when you consider a $2.2 million expenditure annually, you're not even looking at the natural capital component of things.
No, this is one of my future projects, Boyd.
Okay.
I want to look at the natural assets initiatives and get people to understand the value of what they have beyond a checklist on, PEI is 48% forest. I'm sorry, I don't actually know the number off the top of my head, but to look at it beyond that and say, no, we have this forest is worth X amount of dollars, because without it, you would have to put in flood mitigation. You need, just the carbon sink alone. So yeah.
And it should become formulaic almost, once there's a database to begin with.
Yeah, that's our hope. So that's our next big thing that we want to accomplish at the Alliance. And we feel that with the 25 groups and the 25 boots on the ground, that is a very feasible project for us to undertake with the provincial government, to actually show them what these ecosystem services are actually provided and get them into their financial portfolios.
Now, getting back to the Watershed Management Fund, there's a wide range of criteria that were attached to the fund. Within those criteria, could this funding be allotted to special projects as chosen by the Alliance, such as issues arising from potential wetland loss?
No. Is the short answer. The long answer is, in 2021, PEI Watershed Alliance received $2 million in special project funding that we did go through and accept in expressions of interest and got that money out to the group for those special projects. But the WMF fund is something different. That is, we don't administer that fund. That's administered by the province, in order to kind of keep all the groups functioning in a relatively fair, same way, even with their varying capacities. There's certain metrics they have to meet. They have to hold community events in order to get points. Get points based on their size. And then they have a work plan that gets approved by our provincial biologists, so that we know they're doing good monitoring and they're doing good work in the streams, because all of our streams require maintenance. I worked with a woman who works for CBWest, which is an environmental organization in Nova Scotia. And when talking about nature-based solutions or nature-based strategies for living shorelines and things, she said, if you had to weed your garden, you wouldn't consider it a failure. And that's something that people, when you're replacing hard infrastructure that, lasts for 30 years and you don't have to look twice at it, except for an engineer inspection once a year, that's something that we need to kind of keep in mind. So our groups have to keep going out and make sure the water is flowing. Something could change. Somebody could have had dumped something in the streams. There's always something that needs to be done. And that's how we look at what we're managing. And that's why that fund isn't available technically for special projects.
Now, the PEI Watershed Partnership is described as a coalition of major stakeholders committed to working with the farming and watershed communities to improve the health of PEI's soil and water resources. The Watershed Alliance is part of this partnership. Do you think this organization can play a role in supporting wetland conservation?
They have, and they do. They've done sort of mini wetlands on retired farmland. So there's some farms I've toured, and some are up east, where they have, over time, farmland sometimes becomes not farmable anymore, usually due to our wet forests on PEI, and it sloughs, and just you can't safely put a tractor on there anymore. And so what we do is we work with the farmer to get a nature-based solution strategy on there, which is a wetland. So we'll put mini wetlands on the farm, and AWP has funded that. And we're always looking at how these best management practices, are partnerships to help the environment. For example, how does one help a wetland? Well, one keeps the effluent from on land going into it. So it's not always a direct, like, oh, let's build a wetland. Sometimes they'll use this funding to put in a bioreactor. So if you have a sloped farm field at the end of the field, you'll basically dig a hole. This is way over a simplification, and I apologize in advance to Gwen Bessie. But you dig a hole, you put a bunch of chips, cedar chips, some char in there, and make sure that when the water goes down, it goes in there first and then has the pipe go out. So essentially it's cleaned that water. So there's a lot of different projects that actually do help wetlands through the AWP.
And they solve specific problems in specific areas.
Correct. And this is what makes it so unique, is that it builds relationships between the watershed groups and the farmers.
And that is critically important, especially on the island. If you have groups with different perspectives on land use, it's much more productive to actually sit down and talk about it.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, delineation of when an area is legally designated as a wetland has been contentious and has been a concern of industry groups over the years. Can you explain who now carries out the delineation process and how binding these designations would be?
I can't speak to how binding they would be, because that would be a provincial decision. But who delineates their wetlands are the province, our provincial employees. They're the ones that go out. They're the ones that have created the wetland maps and the wetland mapping. Now, you as a private landowner can say, if you wanted to develop something on your land, you can hire a private company. They've recently, thankfully, changed the rules so they can't go out in January and do this, but and put in a new report if you think something's changed. So that's how. But the original designations for wetlands are done by the provincial team,
and that is baseline information that's easily accessible.
Yes, they did a great job at the wetland maps. There's a lot of things that the province does right. The wetland policy, I think, is a good policy.
Oh, I agree. Now, there are several pieces of legislation which provide within them a comprehensive regulatory framework for wetlands of PEI. They include the Environmental Protection Act, the Planning Act, Wildlife Conservation Act, Natural Areas Protection Act. There is also a PEI wetland policy, which was established in 2007, which is centered on a commitment to, quotes, no net loss of wetlands and wetland function. In the spring of 2025, an often stalled and reconfigured development in Summerside once again made the news. This was due to the revelation that a 27-acre wetland was being infilled to comply with the design of a golf course that was the centerpiece of this development. Despite the aforementioned regulatory framework and the net loss wetland policy, this was taking place with full support of the provincial government. Our guest at Laiskonis was responsible for bringing this to the public. How did you find out about this wetland being infilled?
I found out from a member of the public. She was out walking. She walks that area every day. And the day before, she had been out and she saw all sorts of ducks coming in and enjoying themselves. And the next day, she sent me video. It was pretty shocking. It was just red silt coming from someplace, just completely filling in this estuary where the day before the ducks were. I should ask her. I actually don't even know how she thought to call me, but she did. And and so I asked her to send me video, and she did. And so I called up our friends in the permitting department, and I said, hey, I've got this complaint. Can you go check it out? And they checked it out. They're very good. When I call and ask them, hey, is everything legal? And they came back and said, oh, they have a permit for it. And I said, okay, can I see the permit? And then I saw the permit. And then I got real angry, Boyd.
Okay.
So there's not a lot I can do, anybody can do, once a permit is issued, because that person who's developing that wetland has a permit to do so. They are legally entitled to do so.
We'll go step by step through how this was allowed to happen. Now, when the plan to infill these 27 acres was brought to government, according to the wetland policy, it should have been rejected under its first level of avoidance.
Yes.
To move to the next stage of mitigation, quotes, should be perceived as huge barriers that are only to be breached in rare circumstances. That is the language within the watershed policy. What would be defined as a huge barrier or rare circumstances in this instance?
There's two types of development on PEI that is classified by the government. One is an undertaking, and they use the example of the Confederation Bridge is considered an undertaking. And under PEI policy, all golf courses are considered undertakings. And the difference is a development is your house, maybe a shopping mall, maybe an apartment. That's a development. So every single undertaking first should have an environmental impact assessment done even before we start those three.
Now, I'll give you the definition of undertaking in the EPA.
Okay.
Undertaking includes any construction, industry, operation, or other project, or any alteration or modification of any existing undertaking which will or may cause the emission or discharge of any contaminant in the environment to have an effect on any unique, rare, or endangered feature of the environment, have a significant effect on the environment, or necessitate further development which is likely to have a significant effect on the environment, or for cause public concern because of its real or perceived effect or potential effect on the environment. So roughing through this, or just looking at these specific terms of an undertaking, this project in Summerside was an undertaking.
100%.
So therefore, it should have sparked an EIA.
Correct.
And it should have sparked a public meeting.
Correct.
And it did not do so.
Correct. Now you understand why I'm getting so angry.
Yes, I do. That being the case, who is tasked in this process to adjudicate what is or is not in the greater public interest?
That's a fantastic question, and I would love to know the answer. Because in my mind, if you're going to say what's in the greater public interest, only the public can decide that. Or put another way, you can't decide that without hearing from the public.
What is your best guess as to how this took place, so that you have an infilling of 27 acres of wetland, which is clearly an undertaking, which also is clearly not necessarily in the greater public interest, but regardless of these key components, it was permitted?
Yes, because while the policy is good, there are many loopholes in our policy that are not good for our wetland policy, and one of them is at the minister's discretion. So everything that you've just outlined is what you're supposed to do. However, at the minister's discretion is the get out of jail free card. You can go right. You're not supposed to, but we went right to that. And the Minister of the Environment decided, without public consultation, without an environmental impact assessment, without following the own policies that's put in place by the government that they are supposed to uphold, ignored all of that and put this through. And by my estimation, I think it was for $406,000
Yeah.
this person paid.
And there's also interdepartmental communication going on, or lack of communication. But in so doing, ultimately this was permitted. It was a perfectly legal operation. All projects, according to the EIA's four-step review process, all projects are typically reviewed by an interdepartmental technical review committee before a final decision is made on whether or not it will undergo a full environmental assessment. Now, what can you tell us about this committee? Is there any access to this committee's report on this proposal?
I don't know if there is a committee. I've never heard of this committee. I've never seen anybody from the committee. No one's come out and said, I speak for the committee. I don't know anything.
So it would appear that the development in this form zipped through mitigation into the compensation phase with no setbacks. As stated in the body of their wetland policy itself, it should also be noted that the science supporting some aspects of wetland mitigation is not well developed and contains a degree of uncertainty and inherent risk, particularly as it relates to wetland replacement and creation. And the government should, quotes, consider compensation only as a last resort. In this case, the contractor was assessed a fee close to $400,000 to compensate for the loss of the 27 acres of wetland. Does the committee charged with assessing compensation such as this actually exist?
I have no idea.
So if it does exist or does not exist, or whomever tasked to arrive at this number, what criteria were used to arrive at this number?
Couldn't tell you.
So an official from the Provincial Environment, Energy and Climate Action Department said in an email that the $406,500 contribution will be used to support future wetland creation/restoration projects that seek to offset the functional impacts of the wetland alterations. Have you been provided how these criteria are met?
No.
And in what manner the funds are to be dispersed?
No.
So clearly, as stated in the 2023 Interim Coastal Policy, the provincial wetland conservation policy is currently not supported by legislation.
Correct.
Even if it was, there seems to be an abundance of ways to circumvent the most fundamental of its principles. No net loss of wetlands. Where do we begin to align the wetland policy with the regulatory framework and instill enough safeguards to assure it is being adhered to?
Well, it's death by 1,000 cuts, boy. I understand why this is so complicated because the public trust has been eroded, right? I think. And that has taken off the table somebody who, say, wants to, has no power, no voice in the government, doesn't have any friends, and doesn't understand why they're, 1 acre that they want to build a house on, why they can't, because we've made it so that we've done so much damage in other areas. And they seem to only stick to this policy when it's easy for them to do so, or there's not, tourist dollars or compensation dollars on the table. And I don't know what the answer is outside of taking away all the loopholes out of it. If you follow the policy is a good policy. So whoever wrote this, kudos to you. I think it's great. But, having a minister who also didn't even value that property correctly by my very, very, very low estimation that I presented to legislation, I said an acre of wetland is worth about $77,000 in ecosystem services.
Now, the Nature Trust reviewed a property that they own on Crown Bay near Pownell, and they looked at it specifically through the lens of carbon sequestration. And this 100-acre piece of land was valued on this specifically at over $8 million American dollars. So there are extraordinary values attached to specific wetlands that are not being considered in the way that this policy is being administered.
Correct. And there's different jurisdictions that value wetlands differently, which is why this what is a wetland worth? You can pretty much find any number out there that you want to justify, because it also depends on how much money you want to spend, like Island Nature Trust did with carbon sequestration. And carbon sequestration, getting those numbers, it's incredibly expensive.
Yes.
So it's labor intensive, it's man hours, and we don't have that here. We just do not have the capacity. We don't have the money, and that's just a fact. So, in trying to help the government was, in my mind, what we were trying to do was to give them a good estimate, because obviously 1 acre of old wetland, which is what this was, is going to be worth way more than any new wetland. It's going to offer way more ecosystem services than any new wetland that they create. I don't see anyhow.
Now, the sidebar on this, and this is an image that's stuck in my head, is you go over to the provincial building and you look at what used to be the bog there, which is now a parking lot. So you have what would technically be considered a reconstructed wetland in the corner of the parking lot, which is some cattails and maybe a nesting pair of mallard, and that is a created wetland. In its current form, if you jump immediately to compensation, if you look at a wetland forest where the biodiversity in a 1 square meter is probably more than you would find in the city block, if you jumped directly to compensation, then you would have something of so little value.
Yet I got lots of calls last winter when they were plowing the snow and that was filled in with garbage. There's a lot of people that would that do value it and were angry and called me. It is a moving target with evaluating of wetlands, and we have to understand that in dealing with the numbers and the capacity that we have here, that we can't look at every place the same, but we can put a smarter lens to how we're looking at all these different lands, right?
And do you agree, in terms of we're rolling back into natural capital and natural value, that at this point does not have equal value to what profit can be pulled from a piece of land?
Yeah, it's hard. We've looked at forested landscape on PEI for years as what that's worth, and then we go in and evaluate it. And if you look at our current inventory, that's still how we evaluate it. It's not being evaluated for its ecosystem services. And I think we can all agree that if we were to cover all of Canada with asphalt, every single inch of it, that would be an unlivable hellscape. Right? You could probably agree with that.
Yes, certainly, yes.
Yeah. So, okay. Now, there would be a million reasons why, but let's just pick two on why that would be bad. Let's say there would be no permeable surfaces for water to get through, so we'd have no clean drinking water. That's just one. Two, it'd be incredibly hot, and we'd have no wildlife. So let's just look at those two. So what we're looking at when we look at the island is these are the things that we're taking away, and we're not looking at it in a big picture. And it is death by 1,000 cuts, because what we're doing is we're taking away permeable surfaces that recharge our drinking water. And as far as I can tell, we're still in the middle of a drought. And if we don't start making smarter decisions and looking at our ecosystem as a whole, as a biodome, and looking at the biodiversity and all these things that get created through leaving our natural assets intact where we can. We are not against development, but we would like to see some responsible development on the island. And that's not what we're seeing. And this is why it's an issue. And I understand that it's a hard topic. And this is why it's so divisive. But we have to start thinking 100 years from now, we're not going to have any flood protection if we keep going the way we are. At some point, we have to stop and think of the future.
In a parallel topic here, but the 2025 PEI State of the Wildlife Report, the Forest, Fish and Wildlife Division stated they're working to secure more protected land for some animals. They stated that around 4.5% PEI is currently reserved for wildlife, and that's less than 2/3 of the targeted 7%. So again, wetland conservation is a critical component to wildlife corridors and the reaching a target of 7% of land. And again, rolls back into the undervalued component of wetland.
I'll give you a great example. We're using technology. We just did a helicopter flight over Morel River, and we had a debrief yesterday. And what we were looking for were cold water refuges for salmonids, fish. And we're learning as we go a lot about these, and we discovered some that we didn't know were there. And what we're seeing on some of these is that we don't know it's there. We didn't know it was there, so we don't know how to protect it. But it's also it can be right next to a field, And so we need to know these things so that we can say, this is high value, and this is why it's high value. And we need to act to protect that. And we need to do that with compensating private landowners accordingly for that land. And then we need to maintain it and protect it. But we're learning how, unfortunately, we have to relearn how everything is connected. so that we understand that acre in downtown Summerside might not seem as important as a different acre someplace else, but we have to start looking at ecosystem services and how what we're doing is damaging and who we're damaging.
And also the irreplaceable element of an established wetland.
Yes.
One thing that we haven't talked about are the watercourse, wetland, and buffer zone activity permit.
Yep.
Now, the State of the Coast report that came out in 2023 suggested that, as done with development permits, buffer zone activity permits should be posted and made publicly accessible to support transparency in administration of policies relating to coastal zone management. Because right now, to get a buffer zone activity permit appears to be a rubber stamping event. It's a very easy thing to achieve.
It's not a difficult thing to achieve, and they have a contractor list of approved contractors that the province uses that can get these permits. Our watershed groups have to have these permits as well. It's a good idea, and in Fiona, I know they made a lot of exceptions. So they were to help landowners get some, dead wood areas. It wasn't a bad thing, but I can't really speak. Again, I don't work there, so it's hard for me to speak on their processes. And if it's legal, they have to give it, right? So that's where I look at the policies and what are the criteria. And if the criteria are being met, then they're going to give out that permit, right? So what I look at it is I'll look at the criteria for something, and that's where I try to move the needle. And I think that is maybe what should be changed.
But certainly there are many circumstances where legal and right are not necessarily the same thing.
Oh, 100%.
One thing that was put forward again in this PEI State of the Coast report, and one thing that is a recommendation, is improved coordination is necessary between land use planning and development authorities, both provincial and municipal. And you brought that up in your presentation too. And the Department of Environment, Energy and Climate Action, the organization responsible for the issuance of buffer zone activity permits, the importance of cooperation between these groups is highlighted in that they have to be monitored, that there has to be a clear idea of what the activity is that is being applied for. They must be maintained, and there has to be some presence there while this activity is taking place. Because buffer zones have also been a very contentious item for as long as there's been rivers. We're kind of rolling back into what you recommended or what your organization has recommended. You talk about a critical review of the permitting process that approved wetland infill and highlighted the need for transparency. On many different levels, it's a call that's coming across from many different places. Just a more accessible, transparent method or process in place. There's suggestions that were put forward also by Nature Trust. And one of the recommendations is to strike an independent commission to review the wetland policy, related policies, and legislation. And they also, in this, they suggested that the Forestry Commission be kind of a template for this commission. Do you think that's of any value?
Yes, of course they do. The problem is they have the data, they have the reports, they have all the information they need to make decisions. They don't. The public trust is eroding every single time one of these hits the news, and it's just going to keep happening. And I don't see action. I don't see transparency. I saw great work done with that Forestry Commission report. I thought it was such a great tool. It was Islanders coming together after Fiona.
It was an ideal model at that time.
It really was. And then they turned it in, and the minister got shuffled out, and we never heard anything outside of, well, we're not going to enact everything. And that's all I've heard of it. So, yes, is it a good model? But we need something with teeth, and I don't know that, obviously that didn't have teeth. So.
No. So, but there's a clear need to move the proverbial needle on this.
We need some transparency, and we need to know what the process is, and we don't. It's counter everything that's in their policy that they say they're going to do.
experienced a willingness within government to do this, within the people that are tasked to do it. But there's so many factors that erode that you, for instance, will go back to Summerside, where a ministerial engagement, shall we call it,
that.
stopped a process that was clearly in line to happen, and the people that were attempting to bring this forward were not allowed to do so. So that is a culture that needs to be changed somehow.
Yeah, again, I can't speak to how any of these departments don't work in them. But yeah, this culture is in how many reports do they need to understand what's happening? You know, they're not stupid people. These are choices they're making. They don't, they call a bunch of people to present and give all this great data and then sit on it and don't use it. It's like they want to show that we're doing something, but ultimately they're not doing anything. They're commissioning reports. They're having people come and say what's the obvious, what everybody knows, and then they do nothing with the information.
Now, you say in your presentation, you said the most effective driver of change is not creating new policies, but fully enforcing existing ones without exceptions, exemptions, or loopholes.
That is a direct quote from, I want to give credit where credit is due, is from A.R. Siders, and she runs the climate department in the University of Delaware, and she was our keynote speaker for Coastal Zone Canada 2025, which was on PEI this year. It's a biannual conference, national conference. And there was people from our government in the audience. We had people from all over Canada. It was an international conference. And that single statement really struck a chord with everybody in that room. And that's why I wanted to bring it to that presentation, because I want people to understand that your intentions are good, but your follow through is bad.
But we come back to one very hard-edged, straightforward recommendation that the Watershed Alliance put forward in this context. And it is require environmental impact assessments and public consultation before a permit is granted.
Correct.
Because at this point, and we're rolling back into the culture that seems to be in place now, that permits are backfilled into a situation that you can initiate a development with the understanding that you're going to get a permit.
Again, that would be a departmental procedure that I would not have any knowledge of, but on the outside looking in, that is exactly what it seems to be.
So by simply applying the policy as written and as supported within that framework, there is a baseline requirement for an impact assessment and consultation before the permit is granted, and just be a simple matter of enforcement. And again, we're hitting the wall of how do we make that happen.
They're understaffed. They can't. I mean, I think, and I said this in my presentation, CBC reported we have like double the amount of real estate agents now on the island that we did a few years ago. So 500 to 1,000. I can't remember what the number was, but that's a huge increase in moving red dirt on this island, which is what we love to do. So and this is why the people that work in the provincial departments are great, because when somebody does call and I call them to let them know, they act. But if nobody sees it and I don't get a call, or somebody doesn't know to call, or somebody doesn't know what's wrong, it's probably going to happen. You can probably find an area where a house was built and no permits were acquired, but it was 2 years after the fact. And then what do? Take down the house? No, of course not. You issue a fine.
But it's also, I personally think one of the critical areas of weakness in the legislative framework is the executive backdoor, yes, the ministerial discretion, 100%. Because that trumps the policy.
It's a unfortunate but fair and accurate choice of words.
Well, maybe on that note, thank you, Heather, for finding the time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's always good to talk about the environment and what you and all your listeners can do.
With the islands, the Alliance has experienced literally in the streams and salt marshes of the island. Who better to describe the state of our wetlands in the process and place to conserve them? I'm just going to finish this off by stating that wetlands are integral to the well-being of the island's environment, from their role as nursery to countless species and to buffers to drought and flooding, to carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, and filtering of groundwater. Unfortunately, their degradation or destruction is often looked upon as simply the cost of doing business. Regulatory frameworks are presented as red tape and unnecessary delays for proposed development projects. The provincial wetland policy uses strong language on the value of wetlands and the necessity to conserve them. The concept of no net loss is the policy's central principle. Be that as it may, how this policy is being administered paints a much different picture. Projects are routinely green-lit, which do irreparable damage to our wetlands by bypassing, misinterpreting, or simply ignoring the regulatory framework put in place to protect them. Phrases like public good are used without adequate qualification. Environmental impact assessments and public meetings, though central to the policy, are rarely used. Compensation is extracted from developers under the auspices of somehow replacing the wetland infilled during construction. Given the structure and complexity of wetlands, replacing them adequately is not a viable option. It's only a justification. There needs to be significant changes made to the now dated wetland policy and how it is enforced. Ministerial privilege must no longer be standard operating procedure. Wetlands are much too valuable to be sacrificed in order to wring every available dollar out of a piece of land. Once again, we thank Heather Laiskonis for being with us today. Thank you for those of you who have listened to our conversation. We welcome any comments you may have. If you found anything of interest, please share our podcast and consider becoming a subscriber.